Welcome to week 8 of the QUT Design Lab series of videos supporting our program based on Wendy Laura Belcher's second edition of Writing Your Journal article in 12 weeks. I acknowledge the Turrbal and Yugara peoples as the traditional custodians of the unceded lands in Meanjin, where I'm recording this. And I recognise that these lands and waterways have always been places of teaching, learning, research, creativity, storytelling, and arts. I'm your writing wellbeing coach, Dr. Abby Winter, and this week we're talking about presenting your evidence. But first, as always, a moment of reflection. This time, take a moment to think about the best feedback on your writing that you've ever received. This week, we're going to talk about the ways and places to present your evidence, so it leads on neatly from last week's analysis of the quality of your evidence to make sure it's good and right and enough and well interpreted. Belcher starts this week's chapter by talking about that feeling of wanting to stop working on your piece of writing and ways to figure out whether that's just part of the normal human, I don't wanna, or if it's because the clever back of your brain has maybe figured out what she calls a fatal flaw in your argument. If it's that, she recommends giving your draft to a friend or colleague who knows your field and checking in with them on whether they also see that fatal flaw, and maybe talking through solutions. Writing doesn't have to be a solo sport, even for sole-authored publications. Make use of the clever people around you who are willing to help you if you ask for it. Belcher then does a bit of foregrounding, talking about the ways that scientific or quantitative articles present evidence, either in their methods, findings, or discussion sections, and how humanities or qualitative articles tend to weave their evidence more throughout. But I find that a lot of her scientific or quantitative examples also fit quite nicely as ways to think about the HUMINT, humanities and interpretive social science or qualitative writing as well. So I'm actually going to structure this week's class around the 3 sections of methods, findings, and discussion, even if that's not what we label them. The other thing she talks about up front is illustrations, and she has a nice section on pages 242 to 243 about getting permissions to use other people's images. So if you're doing that, those pages are worth a read. In terms of method, her biggest recommendation is to be brief in describing your methods and sources, unless obviously it's a methodology piece, in which case describe away. Think about whether your audience, the readers, are going to know your source. If they do, or should, don't spend long on it. If I'm writing up a case study, I'm not going to spend more than a couple of sentences on case study because I'll expect most of my readers to broadly know what I mean when I cite either Stake, who has a broadly constructivist approach, or Yin, who's more of a positivist. For your findings, Belcher has 3 main recommendations. Firstly, and this one bugs me too, make sure all of your tables and graphs are standardized. Make sure your graphs show a scale. If you can, make your graphs all use the same scale so your reader can scan between them to see the differences. If your referencing style permits it, label your axes so I know what I'm looking at, the percentage of women employed in full-time work per calendar year. Finally, it's less of an issue these days, but some of us are old-fashioned and preferred to read in hard copy, so make sure your graphs or tables or illustrations still make sense in black and white. Next, think about your evidence in terms of your argument. Don't just dump all of your data and expect your reader to be able to make sense of it. Lead them to what's important. Leave out what doesn't make your argument stronger. Be selective. And then make sure you organize your findings. I think we've talked before about this not being a detective novel, so don't feel compelled to lay out your findings in the order that you found them. Use your argument and organize your findings to strengthen and support your position. Finally, and this is the biggest section, is presenting your evidence in your discussion. Belcher starts by reiterating your hypothesis, or in our case, argument or position. Then think about the implications. What does your research tell us? What might need to change? What's the meaning? Next, be the devil's advocate. Question your findings. Are there alternative explanations? Could what you found just be by chance because of the people you've talked to or the documents you've read? Does your explanation cover everything, or are there bits of your data that are left out? If so, how are you going to handle them? because if they're in your findings, then they have to be discussed. But it's not good research just not to talk about the bits that you don't agree with or that don't fit your model or explanation. So make sure you're covering them somehow. And the next thing to do is discuss the limitations of your research. There's an author I love called Paul Sylvia who wrote a great little book about how to be a more productive writer called How to Write a Lot. And I've actually taken my position on limitations from him. Why would you spend time jumping up and down talking about the things that are not perfect about your research? Sure, some journals require a limitations section, but that doesn't mean you have to dwell on them. If you have to put limitations in, try to frame them in terms of what you'd have done differently. That might be in an ideal world where you have access to all of the money and all of the time and all of the people. Or it might be lessons you've learned for next time you do this type of research. As Paul Sylvia says on page 86 of the second edition of How to Write a Lot. Describing limitations is a useful educational exercise, but it's often pointless in an article intended for a professional journal. Most of what pass for limitations are merely directions for future research. Yes, it would have been nice to have a larger sample with a broader range of ages, relations, religions, and cultures. Yes, it would have been nice to have an even fancier methods and more time points. Yes, it's conceivable that a different study that uses different measures with a different sample would find something different. Other limitations are so generic to an area of research that it's irksome to reread the same paragraph of ritual self-flagellation in every article. As always, do what the articles in your target journal do, but if they don't indulge in the ritualistic self-abasement of the generics limitations paragraph, omit it. End quote. Okay, back to our guidebook. Wendy Belcher's next suggestion is to make sure you've done the analysing before you start writing the discussion. As I've said before, it's not a mystery novel you're writing here. You don't need to lead the reader step by step through what you experienced. Instead, take some time and play around with different ways of categorising your data, always making sure that it supports your argument. Or indeed that your argument changes because of the data you've collected. Remember, you're not a scientist in a lab trying to support a hypothesis. You're writing this article to make a contribution to your field's knowledge. So if your data points you in a different direction than you originally thought, go with that. Just remember to go back and reshape your argument throughout the rest of the article so that whatever you're writing about in your discussion doesn't come as a great leap into left field, but as a beautifully logical thing that you've been building towards. When I was doing my PhD, a very small part of it was talking to people about the different training approaches that two large-scale change projects were using. One was just in time, call me when you need me, and the other was come to this room on this day to get trained. And I'd gone into it absolutely convinced that the just-in-time approach was the best one. So I was surprised when my respondents said that they liked the certainty of knowing that the room on the day was booked and that they didn't need to think about the new way of doing things until then. From my perspective, it's important to be doing research with what the Buddhists call the beginner mind, that part of why we're doing humanities research and not replicating lab experiments, right? Because we want to find out things and allow ourselves to be surprised. So be open to the possibilities in your data. Belcher's next suggestion is for what you've edited and cut on your way through. And this is a great idea for any kind of writing. Don't just throw it away. Put it into a new document because it might form the basis of another article using these data, or be part of supporting a different argument for your next piece of research. On pages 249 to 250, she talks about illustrations, which is basically to make sure they're high quality and that you have permission for them. Then she goes into the humanities recommendations. Firstly, make sure you have more interpretation than quotation. And this one's my issue. As I've mentioned before, I fall in love with other people's words. But it's important to put your own voice around others' words. You've chosen to include those words for a reason, because they say it better than you can, and because they support your argument, right? So contextualize and interpret them for your reader. And I think I've been reiterating this one until you're sick of it. You have to make really clear the connections to your argument, the why and the so what. Whatever you're discussing, frame it with your argument. Why does it matter? Why does it here? As Belcher says on page 252, you don't eat a cake the way you make a cake. When we authors write an article, we often state our idea most richly at the start of a paragraph or section when we have written our way toward understanding. But when revising, we need to move that richness to an earlier location because readers need the richer part first. Point first, evidence second. Finally, Belcher reminds us to pay attention to the way that your discipline or field presents evidence. Are there particular things that are expected? Think about the articles you've read in your target journal or wherever you're aiming to publish. On page 253, Belcher gives a little table for you to take notes on it. That's us for this week. Next week, we're going to talk about your piece's structure. So your homework is to read pages 273 to 278 and do her exercises on outlining a published article and then highlighting the structure of yours. Purple for structure signals, green for subject terms, and blue for argument. For those in the QUT Design Lab program, you get to choose whether to do 1 or 2 PowerPoint slides or a single A4 page that holds the whole outline of your article so you can see the structure, because we're going to talk about that next week. And of course, plan and track your writing time. See you next time.